This lecture is meant to continue talking about the growing sectionalism versus nationalism divide that's happening in the United States in the early part of the 1800s. And so we mentioned a couple of things that explain why sectionalism kind of increases, right? But there's also is an attempt by the federal government, the national government, to increase and promote a strong national approach. And so there's some things that do happen in that sense, but that also then in return kind of helps promote sectionalism as well in some way, right? By trying to make everything centralized, people in the different regions kind of resist that. And so that's some things we're going to look at today that relate to this growing separation between those who want a strong national government and those who want strong state governments. It's just a quick review of what the word nationalism is, which we should have known from last year. It's essentially just pride in one's nation and customs and history. And like we've mentioned, a theme throughout United States history, even to this day, is this conflicting relationship between pride in one's country versus pride in one's state or region. And this is particularly present in American history leading up to the Civil War. And so there's some examples of federal power increasing through action made by the Supreme Court. And one famous case that they ruled on was Gibbs v. Ogden, which happened in 1824. And so this was over steam shipping. And so as we remember from previous classes, Robert Fulton is the man who kind of patents and invents the steamship. And the New York State Legislature, the New York State Assembly, gives Robert Fulton a monopoly over steam shipping in the state, which means he's the only one that's allowed to do it. He has complete control over the industry. And to make money, what he does is he hires subcontractors to drive these ferry lines. And mostly it's along the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. So he's crossing state lines here. And one subcontractor was a man named Ogden. Last name Ogden. Someone else then decides to challenge this, a man named Gibbons. He believes that he has a right to create a steamship company. And since it will kind of go across state lines, he believes that New York State Legislature can't control him if it's not only in New York. And so this gets taken all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that's what SCOTUS stands for there, the Supreme Court of the United States. And they rule that individual states, like New York, cannot regulate interstate commerce, right? Only the federal government can. So since this business was happening in both New York and New Jersey, New York had no right to regulate and control that sector of the economy. And this is a kind of a major achievement, a major victory for those who wanted a stronger national government, because it's giving the federal government more power and preventing individual states from kind of limiting trade and businesses between the states. Kind of in a similar vein there, you have another case that actually happens a few years earlier in McCulloch v. Maryland. And so as we know, with the American system, there's this Bank of the United States, right, a national bank. Excuse me. And the Maryland people, the state government of Maryland did not want the Bank of the United States, right? And their goal was to make it fail, right? And so they decided they were going to tax the local branch of the bank, right? Put a tax on it, kind of take away some of their profits, some of their money. Chief Justice Marshall, again, this is kind of he's the first Chief Justice here, one of the first Chief Justices. I actually believe he's the second Chief Justice. And he rules that Maryland has no right to tax a federal bank, because it's essentially, in his logic, his argument, this would give states power to overrule federal legislation. And again, the Constitution kind of makes it very clear that federal law is supreme over state law. Right? And so with this case and others like it, Chief Justice Marshall rules on many laws that limit states' rights, prevents them from tries to strengthen the federal government. Another front that kind of a national effort is being pushed on, not a sectional, is foreign policy. And this is probably one of the most successful aspects of this national push, because even the different sections can kind of agree that they want kind of to be represented well internationally and to gain more territory. And so at the time, the Secretary of State, this is under President Monroe, is John Quincy Adams, who will actually succeed Monroe as president afterwards. But his prioritization is to expand the nation and the security of the nation. So he's involved with a couple of important treaties with different countries. So there's the Rush-Bagot Treaty. This is in 1817, and it's between the British and the Americans agreed to demilitarize the Canadian-U.S. border, which is still demilitarized today, right? So this is a long-lasting impact here. They also agreed to establish the 49th parallel as the border. And again, I'll show you a map in a few slides, but that border is still what exists today. Um, and that border is for most of the border of Canada and the United States. There's parts of it up in New England and Maine that it's a little higher, but generally speaking, the 49th parallel is that agreed upon line even to this day. Another treaty, 2 years later in 1819, is with Spain. That's the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this is when Spain decides to give up control of Florida to the Americans. So this is when Florida becomes part of America as a territory, not as a state right away. And they also give up claims to the Oregon Territory out in the northwestern part of the country. And so having one less country there claiming it allows the United States to have kind of a stronger claim to it. Right, so here's that map I was talking about. You have here the 49th parallel, which is the current border of the United States and Canada even to this day, right up here, right, for the most part anyway. And that's an agreed upon line. You also have the Spanish giving up control of Florida and the yellow shaded areas here. That was the Florida territory, right? It's Florida plus kind of the Gulf coast of Mississippi and Alabama. And you also have Spain giving up the claim to territory in Oregon, right? But there are still other countries. The British still have some claim to this territory, and they do get some of it, as you can see. The green shaded here goes up. Also, Russia began creating a few settlements in Oregon as well, right? So this is definitely still a contested territory, but there's just one less contestant involved, which is better for the United States' claim. Right at this time, though, most of the West and Southwest, right, this is all still part of Spain. This is not the United States yet, right, including Texas. So this is kind of what the United States looks like. Most of the East Coast is now states, and you have a few Midwestern states as well, right? But it's still relatively undeveloped. Right, and so the president at this time is President Monroe, James Monroe, and he issues what has become known as the Monroe Doctrine, right, to foreign policy. And in this policy, Monroe is reacting to European interests that is continuing in the New World, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he does not like that. He does not like the idea that Europeans are trying to be involved in New World politics, right, in the Western Hemisphere. And so he makes an official statement that says Europeans should not establish new colonies. They should not try to overthrow newly independent republics. In the 1820s, you have a lot of 18 teens, 1820s, you have a lot of countries in South America gaining independence from Spain. And he also, kind of to give some teeth to this claim, to this proclamation, Monroe declares that any actions that Europeans take in the New World would be considered dangerous to American interests and dealt with accordingly, right? So it's kind of saying that Americans will not be afraid to intervene in situations where the Europeans are trying to take advantage of these new countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in return, they agree to kind of remain neutral in European affairs, which largely is true up until World War I. Right? And in the mix of all this, and we'll talk more about this in the next unit, you have westward migration. So as sectionalism is growing, as efforts to nationalize are growing, as foreign policy is changing, you have people continually moving west from out of the eastern coast to land out west because it was plenty of it was fertile, and it was cheap. And so by 1818, just a few decades after the founding of the country, you have 22 states up from 13. Right? But this expansion west brings problems because with the expansion west, you have debate over what to do with slavery. Right? And as we mentioned earlier in the year, slavery has always been controversial. Even at the founding, even among the founding fathers, at the Constitutional Convention, there was serious debate about what to do with slavery. As unpleasant as it was that they decided to keep it, and unfortunate as it was they decided to keep it, they do try to put some efforts into at least limit it or set up the future abolishment of it, right? By limiting, by saying in 20 years after the Constitution, then they could talk about limiting it, leaving it up to certain states to abolish it, right? So there was efforts made, but not the efforts we would have liked to see as a modern perspective. But a major source of tension was should slavery be allowed to expand westward? Right? The northern states, who by this point had largely abolished slavery, did not want more slave states because they felt that more slave states would tip the balance of power in the Senate. Right? They wanted to balance the power in the Senate between the northern free states and the southern slave states. And so Missouri kind of throws a wrench in that plan, right? So Missouri is relatively, it's in the Midwest, but it's relatively north. And they wanted to permit slavery. They wanted to enter in the Union as a slave-holding state. Northerners feared this would tip the balance. Right in the middle of this, Alabama is also admitted as a slave state. That was kind of clearly Southern, so kind of accepted. And so in 1820, Henry Clay, which is kind of where he gets his name as the Great Compromiser, works out a compromise where they're going to allow Missouri as a slave state, but in return, Maine, up in the north, which was not yet a state, will be allowed in as a free state, so that then restores that balance between slave and free states. And they set a certain latitude line, like the 49th parallel we mentioned was the latitude line that made the boundary between Canada and U.S. The 36th parallel line would be the future dividing line between slave and free states. So anything to the south of that state, south of that line, I should say, would be allowed to permit slavery. Anything to the north would not be, right? With Missouri being the sole exception to that. And so in this sense, really if looking at a map here, that would mean most future states would actually be free states. And most of the other ones would be, a few of them would be slaveholding states. And so this kind of keeps the peace for a couple more decades. But by the time we reach the 1840s, 1850s, there's another major controversy that develops, and that's with the future state of Kansas, right, which would be above this line, but wanting to, if the debate over slavery is intense there. And eventually this debate over slavery is going to be one of the major causes of the Civil War. Okay, so we will continue talking about this more, right, and move into talking about the next president, an important president, Andrew Jackson, in future lessons.